Millionaire didn't know he had a daughter until a humble mother brought her girl to a job interview. A life-changing revelation that would alter the course of 3 lives forever. What happens when wealth meets humility, when past meets present, and when a simple job interview becomes the bridge between a father and the daughter he never knew existed? Before we dive into this beautiful story, make sure to comment where you're watching from. Your support means the world to us and helps our channel continue bringing you these touching stories of human connection. Now, let's step into a tale of unexpected discovery, forgiveness, and the true meaning of family. The sprawling glass fortress of Westridge Enterprises dominated the Boston skyline, its reflective windows glinting in the morning sun like 1,000 watchful eyes. Inside, on the 40th floor, Alexander Westridge sat behind his imposing mahogany desk, surrounded by the trappings of success, awards lining the walls, the subtle tick of a watch worth more than most people's cars, and the quiet hum of an empire at work beyond his office doors. At 52, Alexander had the sharp features of a man who'd spent his life in pursuit. His dark hair was now threaded with distinguished silver at the temples, and fine lines gathered at the corners of his eyes that had seen boardrooms crumble and competitors fall. What those eyes hadn't seen, however, was the gentle smile of a daughter who shared his determined chin and analytical gaze. Alexander glanced at his watch, a habit formed through decades of time being synonymous with money. 10 minutes until his next meeting. 10 minutes to review the quarterly projections that showed Westridge Enterprises continuing its 15-year streak of growth. 15 years since he transformed a struggling tech startup into a billion-dollar corporation. 15 years since he'd left behind the person he used to be, along with anyone who knew that person. Mr. Westridge? His assistant's voice came through the intercom, interrupting his thoughts. Your 3 o'clock is here. Ms. Elena Morales for the executive assistant position. Send her in, Alexander replied, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality he reserved for initial meetings. He didn't glance up immediately when the door opened, finishing a note on the candidate's resume before raising his eyes. When he did look up, the world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. Elena Morales stood just inside the doorway, her posture straight despite the clear nervousness in her eyes. She wore a simple navy dress, not designer but tasteful and professional. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, revealing familiar features that Alexander couldn't quite place. But it wasn't Elena who caused Alexander's carefully constructed composure to falter. It was the teenage girl standing slightly behind her. I apologize, Mr. Westridge, Elena said quickly, her voice carrying a soft accent that stirred something in his memory. My daughter's school let out early today, and my regular sitter canceled at the last minute. I couldn't reschedule this interview, so I had to bring her with me. I promise she won't be any trouble. Alexander barely heard the words. He was looking at the girl, 15, perhaps 16 years old, with her chin tilted slightly upward in a gesture so familiar it made his chest tighten. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, met his without wavering. She had her mother's coloring, but there was something else, something in the set of her jaw, the analytical assessment in her gaze. Your name? Alexander asked the girl directly, his voice suddenly hoarse. Sophia, she answered with a confidence that belied her age. Sophia Morales. The name meant nothing to him, and yet everything about her seemed to echo with recognition. Alexander forced himself to look away, back to Elena. And then he saw it, behind the additional lines of age and worry, behind the professional mask she wore, a face from 15 years ago. A face from another life. Ellie? He whispered, using a name he hadn't spoken in over a decade. Elena's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed. It's Elena now, she corrected with quiet dignity. And I'm here for the executive assistant position, Mr. Westridge. My qualifications are all in my resume. The formal tone snapped Alexander back to the present moment, to the interview that was supposed to be taking place. But his mind raced with calculations. The girl's age, Elena's appearance in his office after all these years, the unmistakable resemblance. Of course, he said, gesturing to the chairs across from his desk. Please both of you sit down. As they settled into the plush leather seats, Alexander attempted to focus on the resume before him, but his eyes kept drifting to Sophia, who had pulled out a book and was reading quietly. Her profile in concentration was like looking at a ghost of himself at that age. The same slight furrow between the brows, the same way of absent-mindedly tucking hair behind an ear. You've had an impressive career path, Alexander began, forcing his attention back to Elena. Stanford, then work with several notable tech companies before taking a break from the corporate world. I chose to prioritize raising my daughter, Elena replied evenly. but I've maintained my skills through freelance work and continued education. And what brings you to Westridge Enterprises specifically? Alexander asked, following the script of questions he'd prepared, though they now seemed meaningless in the face of the much larger questions swirling in his mind. Elena met his gaze directly. Your company has an excellent reputation for innovation and employee support. The position would utilize my organizational skills and technical background, while the hours would accommodate my responsibilities as a single mother. The words single mother hung in the air between them. Alexander's throat felt dry. Sophia, he said suddenly, turning to the girl. What are you reading? Sophia looked up, surprised at being addressed. Theoretical Quantum Physics. An introduction, she answered, holding up the book so he could see the cover. I'm interested in pursuing physics in college. Alexander couldn't hide his surprise, or the swell of something that felt dangerously like pride. That's graduate-level material. Sophia shrugged, a gesture so casual and yet so reminiscent of himself that Alexander felt his heart constrict. I like the challenge. The interview continued, but it was a mere formality, a thin veneer of professionalism over the emotional earthquake rumbling beneath. Alexander asked questions about software proficiency and management experience while his mind calculated possibilities and probabilities. Elena answered competently while steadfastly avoiding any acknowledgement of their shared past. When the interview concluded, Alexander found himself standing, extending his hand. Thank you for coming in, Ms. Morales. My assistant will be in touch about next steps very soon. Elena hesitated before taking his hand. The brief contact sent memories cascading through him. A small apartment filled with laughter, ambitious dreams shared over cheap wine, the feeling of potential and possibility before money and success had redefined his world. Thank you for your time, Elena replied formally, withdrawing her hand quickly. Come on, Sophia. As they turned to leave, Alexander spoke again, unable to stop himself. Sophia, how old are you? Elena stiffened, but Sophia answered without hesitation. 15. I'll be 16 next month. May 16th, Alexander said softly, not a question. Now Sophia looked surprised. Yes. How did you know? Elena intervened before he could answer. We should go. Thank you again, Mr. Westridge. As the door closed behind them, Alexander sank back into his chair, his mind reeling. 15 years and 11 months ago, he had walked away from Elena Ruiz, now Morales, and the modest life they had shared while he clawed his way up from middle management at a failing tech company. He had been offered a chance at wealth and success, but it had meant relocating immediately, severing ties with his past to fully embrace a future of wealth and influence. Elena had been heartbroken but proud. Too proud to tell him, it seemed, about the child she must have discovered she was carrying after he left. Alexander reached for his phone, then hesitated. What right did he have to disrupt their lives now? What could he possibly say after 15 years of absence? And yet, the image of Sophia's face, his expressions animated by Elena's warmth, refused to fade from his mind. His assistant's voice came through the intercom again. Mr. Westridge, your 4 o'clock is here. Cancel it, he replied abruptly. Cancel everything for the rest of the day. For the first time in years, Alexander Westridge had something more important than business to attend to. Across town, in a modest 2-bedroom apartment, Elena's hands shook as she set her purse down on the small kitchen counter. The interview had gone exactly as she'd feared it might. She hadn't wanted to apply to Westridge Enterprises at all, but the position had been perfect, excellent pay, comprehensive benefits, and hours that would allow her to be home when Sophia needed her. She'd calculated the odds of actually encountering Alexander as minimal. He was the CEO, after all, not typically involved in hiring executive assistants. But when her babysitter had canceled, forcing her to bring Sophia along, Elena had known with a sinking certainty that fate had finally caught up with her. Mom? Sophia's voice pulled her from her thoughts. Are you okay? You look pale. Elena forced a smile. Just tired, honey. Interviews are stressful. Sophia studied her with that penetrating gaze that had always reminded Elena so painfully of Alexander. He knew my birthday, she said, not a question but a statement of fact that required explanation. It's probably in some background check they did, Elena replied, turning away to fill a glass with water, avoiding her daughter's eyes. No, it's not, Sophia said quietly. Mom, who is he? I saw how you looked at each other. The glass nearly slipped from Elena's hand. She set it down carefully before turning to face her daughter. Sophia stood with her arms crossed, her expression a mirror of the one Alexander had worn countless times during their 2 years together, determined, analytical, unwilling to accept evasion. "We knew each other a long time ago," Elena admitted, choosing her words carefully. "Before you were born." "Is he my father?" The question hung in the air, a weight Elena had been carrying for nearly 16 years, now suddenly unbearably heavy. "Sophia." "Don't lie to me," Sophia interrupted, her voice trembling slightly despite her attempt at control. "I've asked about him my whole life, and you've always said he wasn't part of our lives anymore. That he made his choice. But you never said he didn't know about me." Elena sank into a chair at their small kitchen table, feeling the carefully constructed walls of her life beginning to crumble. "It's complicated." "Then uncomplicated," Sophia demanded, pulling out the chair across from her mother. "Did Alexander Westridge walk out on us, or does he not know I exist? Because those are very different things, Mom." The accusation in her daughter's voice cut Elena deeply. She had always told herself that she was protecting Sophia from rejection, protecting her from knowing that her father had chosen wealth and success over family. But had she been protecting Alexander instead? Protecting him from obligation, from disruption to the empire he was building? Or had she been protecting herself from having to share Sophia, from having to face the man who had broken her heart? "He left before I knew I was pregnant," Elena finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I found out he was already gone, new number, new life. His career was taking off and I didn't want to be the one holding him back." "That wasn't your decision to make," Sophia said, tears welling in her eyes. "It was his. And mine." "You were just a possibility then, Sophia, not even born," Elena protested, reaching for her daughter's hand. "I did what I thought was best." "And now?" Sophia asked, withdrawing her hand. "What's best now?" Elena looked at her daughter, brilliant, strong, perceptive beyond her years. She thought of Alexander's face when he had looked at Sophia, the shock and wonder that had broken through his carefully cultivated corporate mask. "Now," Elena said softly, "I think the truth is best. For all of us." The truth, however, was more complicated than either of them knew. Because while Elena had chosen not to disrupt Alexander's rising career with news of her pregnancy, there were other forces that had kept them apart, other choices made by people with their own agendas. The past was a labyrinth neither of them had fully navigated, and somewhere in its twisting passages lay secrets that would test the fragile possibility of reconciliation now hanging between father and daughter. As dusk settled over Boston, Alexander sat in his penthouse overlooking the city lights, a glass of scotch untouched beside him, staring at a photograph pulled from deep storage in his personal files. In it, a younger version of himself stood with his arm around Elena, both of them laughing, the ocean visible behind them. Their last weekend together before everything changed. His phone lay on the table before him, Elena's number, obtained from her job application, displayed on the screen. All he had to do was press call. But what would he say? What could possibly make up for 15 years of absence, whether he'd known about Sophia or not? And somewhere across the city, in a small apartment with worn furniture but walls covered in academic awards and art, Sophia lay awake staring at the ceiling, her world transformed by a single afternoon, by a face that explained so many of her own features, by the sudden knowledge that half of her history was an unwritten book waiting to be opened. 3 lives, connected by blood and separated by circumstance, now stood at a crossroads. The choices they would make in the coming days would determine whether they remained strangers linked by biology, or found their way to becoming something else, something like family. But first, the full truth would need to come to light, about why Alexander had really left all those years ago, about the powerful forces that had separated them, and about the secrets Elena still kept close to her heart. Because in the shadows of the past lay explanations that could either heal or destroy the fragile possibility of connection now emerging between father and daughter. As night settled fully over Boston, a storm was gathering on the horizon, not of rain and wind, but of emotions long suppressed and truths long buried. And when it broke, nothing would be the same again. The morning after the interview, Alexander sat in his home office, staring at the phone. He had barely slept, his mind racing with memories and possibilities. The expansive space around him, with its leather furniture, custom bookshelves and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston, suddenly felt hollow. For all his wealth and accomplishments, Alexander had never felt the particular emptiness that now consumed him, the awareness of a daughter who had grown up without him. His finger hovered over Elena's number, which his assistant had discreetly provided from her application. What right did he have to disrupt their lives now? And yet, what right did he have to stay away, having glimpsed Sophia's intelligence, her curiosity, her unmistakable resemblance to himself? The expensive watch on his wrist ticked away the seconds as Alexander wrestled with a decision unlike any business negotiation he'd ever faced. Finally, with a deep breath that did little to calm his racing heart, he made the call. "Elena," he said when she answered, his voice steadier than he felt. "We need to talk." There was a long pause on the line, the silence heavy with 15 years of unspoken words. Alexander could hear the soft sound of her breathing, could almost picture the way she would be biting her lower lip, a habit she'd had whenever she was deep in thought. "Yes, we do," Elena finally responded, her voice measured and controlled. "But not over the phone. This isn't a conversation we can have with distance between us." Alexander agreed immediately. "Name the place and time. I'll be there." "There's a cafe called Riverside Beans on Commonwealth Avenue," Elena suggested after another pause. "Tomorrow at 10? It's..." She hesitated. "It's halfway between us." The significance wasn't lost on Alexander. Neutral territory for a conversation 15 years overdue, a symbolic middle ground between his world of luxury and wherever Elena had built her life with their daughter. "I'll be there," he promised, resisting the urge to ask more questions. Those would come tomorrow. After hanging up, Alexander canceled his morning meetings, something he hadn't done for anything short of a global financial crisis in over a decade. His executive team would be shocked, but for once, Alexander didn't care about the impression it would make. Some things were more important than quarterly projections and shareholder confidence. When Alexander arrived at the cafe the next morning, he was struck by how ordinary it was, nothing like the exclusive establishments where he typically conducted business breakfasts. The tables were worn but clean, the atmosphere warm with the scent of coffee and freshly baked goods. It was the kind of place the old Alexander, the one before wealth and status had redefined his existence, would have frequented without a second thought. Elena was already there, seated at a corner table partially hidden by a large potted plant. She wore simple jeans and a burgundy sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders rather than in the tight professional bun from the interview. The casual attire made her look so much more like the Elena he had known years ago, the passionate teacher who had loved poetry and kept wildflowers and recycled wine bottles on their kitchen table. "Is Sophia with you?" he asked as he sat down, unable to hide the hope in his voice. He had worn casual clothes, or what passed for casual in his wardrobe, in an attempt to appear less intimidating, less like the corporate titan whose face occasionally appeared in business magazines. Elena shook her head, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, another familiar gesture that transported Alexander back to their shared past. "She's at school. I wouldn't pull her out for this. And honestly, Alexander, this conversation needs to happen between us first. There's too much history, too many." She searched for the right word, complications that we need to address before involving her further. Alexander nodded, understanding but disappointed. His hands cupped the ceramic mug the server had placed before him, drawing comfort from its warmth as he gathered his thoughts. "She's remarkable, Elena," he finally said, voice softening with genuine admiration. "The way she carries herself, her intelligence, her confidence, you've done an amazing job raising her." Elena's eyes, which had maintained a careful neutrality until now, suddenly flashed with a complex mixture of pride, pain, and something like defiance. "I had to," she replied, her tone carrying years of struggle beneath its controlled surface. "We didn't have the luxury of failure. There was no safety net, no family wealth to fall back on if I made mistakes." She took a sip of her coffee, and Alexander noticed the slight tremor in her hand, the only outward sign of the emotion she was keeping tightly leashed. "Every decision I made from the moment I realized I was pregnant had to be the right one. For her." The implied contrast with his own privileged life wasn't lost on Alexander. He looked down at his Italian leather shoes, the designer watch on his wrist, suddenly conscious of every symbol of wealth he carried. In the years since their separation, he had constructed a life where problems could be solved with money, where difficulties were smoothed away by assistants and advisors. Elena had enjoyed no such luxury. The cafe around them hummed with ordinary life, students typing on laptops, a young mother soothing a fussy toddler, baristas calling out orders. Alexander found himself envying their uncomplicated morning routines, the absence of life-altering revelations in their coffee cups. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally asked, the question that had kept him awake all night, haunting him as he paced his penthouse with a tumbler of scotch that had remained untouched. "About Sophia. About the pregnancy." Elena's eyes met his, steady and unwavering. The warm brown that had once looked at him with love now held a complicated mixture of emotions, residual hurt, protective caution, and something else Alexander couldn't quite identify. You really don't remember what happened the day you left, do you? She asked, her voice quiet but intense. Alexander frowned, mentally rewinding to that pivotal moment 15 years ago. The memories were clear, or at least he had thought they were until this moment. Elena's question suggested there were gaps, blind spots in the narrative he had constructed and carried all these years. I got the offer from Techscape Ventures, he replied, the familiar story flowing easily. Executive track, substantial stock options. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, but I had to leave immediately. You said you couldn't drop everything to follow me, your mother's health, your master's program? You said you wouldn't hold me back. As he spoke, Alexander noticed Elena's expression changing subtly, a mixture of disbelief and something like pity crossing her features. And that's all you remember? Elena asked, something like disbelief crossing her features. She set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, as though needing the small ritual to gather her thoughts. Nothing about the woman who came to our apartment? Nothing about the separation package, or the conditions attached to it? Alexander stared at her blankly, genuine confusion evident in his expression. What woman? What separation package? Elena, what are you talking about? You said you wouldn't hold me back, Alexander continued, the memory clear in his mind. We agreed it was better to make a clean break. I tried calling after I got settled, but your number was disconnected. I even came back to the apartment once about 3 months later, but the landlord said you'd moved out with no forwarding address. Elena's laugh held no humor, just a brittle sound that made Alexander's skin prickle with unease. Is that the story you've been telling yourself all these years? That I just vanished? That I chose to disappear from your life completely? A couple at the next table glanced over, drawn by the tension in Elena's voice. She noticed and lowered her volume, leaning forward across the table. You really don't know, she said, more to herself than to him, a look of dawning realization crossing her face. Before Alexander could respond, Elena reached into her bag, a worn leather satchel that had seen better days, and pulled out a yellowed envelope, its edges soft from handling. I found this last night, after Sophia confronted me about you. I was going through old boxes looking for, I don't know what. Answers maybe. Courage. She turned the envelope in her hands. I was going to burn this years ago, but something stopped me. Maybe some part of me knew this day would come. She slid the envelope across the table. Alexander opened it with growing confusion, pulling out a letter on Techscape Ventures' letterhead, the company that had first hired him away, the stepping stone to his current empire. As he read, the color drained from his face. 15 years earlier. Elena stood in the tiny bathroom of their apartment, staring at the pregnancy test in disbelief. Positive. She and Alexander were going to have a baby. Despite the shock, a smile spread across her face as she imagined telling him. They had talked about children someday when they were more established, but Elena knew Alexander would be thrilled even if this was earlier than planned. The sound of the front door slamming jarred her from her thoughts. She quickly wrapped the test in tissue and tucked it deep in the trash can. This news deserved a special moment. When she emerged from the bathroom, Alexander was pacing their small living room, his expression a mix of excitement and anxiety she'd never seen before. Ellie, he exclaimed, using the nickname only he called her. You won't believe what happened. Techscape Ventures wants me. Senior product development position. Triple my current salary, stock options, the works. Elena felt her heart swell with pride. Alexander had been working tirelessly, his brilliant mind always focused on climbing higher, reaching further. That's amazing. When do you start? His excitement dimmed slightly. That's the thing. They need me in New York. Tomorrow. Tomorrow? Elena repeated, trying to process the implications. But what about your notice period here? Arlise? What about us? Alexander ran a hand through his hair. I know it's sudden, but this is my shot, Ellie. The kind that doesn't come twice. I want you to come with me. Just drop everything? My job, my life here? Elena asked, her hand unconsciously moving to her still flat stomach. You could find another teaching position, Alexander insisted. And we'd have my salary to live on until then. Elena sank onto their worn couch. I can't just leave, Alex. My mother's health is deteriorating. She needs me here. And I'm in the middle of my master's program. So you're saying no? Alexander interrupted, his tone hardening slightly. You won't support this move? I'm saying I need time, Elena clarified. Maybe I could join you in a few months after the semester ends and I can arrange proper care for my mother. Alexander's expression closed. They need an answer today. It's now or never. The pregnancy test in the bathroom seemed to pulse like a beacon. Elena took a deep breath. There's something I need to tell you. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her. Alexander opened it to reveal a sleek, expensively dressed woman in her 40s. Mr. Westridge? I'm Catherine Mercer, VP of Talent Acquisition at Techscape Ventures. May I come in? Elena watched in confusion as the woman entered their modest apartment, barely concealing her disdain for their IKEA furniture and second-hand decor. I understand you have some hesitations about the offer, Catherine said, addressing Alexander while barely acknowledging Elena's presence. We're discussing it, Alexander replied. Elena has commitments here that make an immediate move difficult. Catherine's smile didn't reach her eyes. Perhaps I could speak with both of you privately? These transitions can be complicated, but we always find solutions for the partners of our key acquisitions. What followed was a conversation that altered the course of their lives. While Alexander stepped out to take a congratulatory call from his current boss, Catherine's demeanor changed entirely. Let me be clear, Ms. Ruiz, she said, her voice low and clinical. Alexander Westridge has exceptional potential. The kind that could lead to millions, possibly billions in revenue generation for our company. I know how brilliant he is, Elena replied defensively. Then you should also know he's at a critical juncture. The path to exceptional success requires exceptional focus. Catherine leaned forward. Our research indicates relationships like yours, early, formed during struggle, rarely survive the transition to wealth and prominence. The statistics are quite clear. Elena felt her stomach clench. What are you saying? I'm saying that if you truly care for Alexander's future, you should consider whether you're an asset to his trajectory or an anchor. Catherine's eyes flicked dismissively around their small apartment. He comes from humble beginnings, as do you. But he has the potential to transcend them. Do you? You have no right. I have the right to protect my company's investment, Catherine interrupted. And part of that is ensuring Mr. Westridge isn't distracted by personal complications. She placed a business card on the coffee table. My direct line. When you realize what's best for everyone, call me. We can arrange a generous separation package. After Catherine left and Alexander returned, Elena found herself unable to share her news about the pregnancy. The seeds of doubt had been planted. Would she be holding him back? Would a child, right now, derail the opportunity of a lifetime? That night, as Alexander slept beside her, Elena made the most difficult decision of her life. The next morning, she told him she couldn't drop everything to follow him to New York. That he should take his shot without looking back. That she wouldn't hold him back. What she didn't tell him was that Catherine Mercer had returned while he was packing, with paperwork and a check. The separation package she had mentioned, contingent upon Elena's agreement to cut contact completely. A clean break is best for everyone, Catherine had insisted. Especially for Alexander's career trajectory. Elena had torn up the check but kept her silence about the pregnancy. She would raise their child alone rather than be seen as trapping Alexander with obligation, rather than having her child grow up believing they were an obstacle to their father's success. 2 weeks after Alexander left, when Elena tried to reach him after her mother's unexpected death, she discovered his number had been changed. Emails bounced back as undeliverable. And when she finally worked up the courage to call Techscape Ventures directly, she was informed that Alexander Westridge was unavailable indefinitely. The wall between them had been built, and Elena had no way of knowing that it had been constructed by others, without Alexander's knowledge. In the cafe, Alexander stared at the letter in his hands, a directive from Catherine Mercer to the company's telecommunications department, instructing them to redirect all calls and emails from Elena Ruiz, effectively severing their communication without his knowledge. I never knew you tried to reach me, he said, his voice hollow with shock. After a few months with no word from you, I assumed you'd moved on. And I thought you'd chosen to disappear completely, Elena replied. When I discovered I was pregnant, I tried to find you, but it was like you'd vanished. Eventually, I had to focus on preparing for Sophia's arrival. Alexander placed the letter carefully back in the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. I was manipulated, he said softly. We both were. By people who saw our relationship as an impediment to profit. Would it have changed anything? Elena asked, the question that had haunted her for 15 years. If you had known about Sophia, would you have made different choices? Alexander looked up, meeting her eyes. I want to say yes, unequivocally. But the truth is I don't know who I was back then. I was ambitious, driven, convinced that success meant climbing higher at any cost. He paused, swallowing hard. What I do know is who I am now. And this man, the person I've become, wants nothing more than a chance to know his daughter. Elena studied him, searching for traces of the Alexander she had known, the man she had loved enough to sacrifice her own happiness for his success. She wants to know you too, she finally said. She's angry with me for keeping the truth from her. She has every right to be. We've all made mistakes, Alexander replied. But maybe it's not too late to start again. As they continued talking, the years of separation began to dissolve. Elena shared stories of Sophia's childhood, her first steps, her precocious reading ability, her endless questions about how the world worked. Alexander listened with hunger in his eyes, absorbing every detail of the life he'd missed. When they finally parted hours later, they had a plan. Alexander would meet Sophia properly that weekend at a place of her choosing. No pressure, just a chance to begin. 3 days later, the Boston Museum of Science bustled with weekend visitors, families with excited children, groups of students, couples holding hands as they explored exhibits. Among them walked a man whose face occasionally appeared in business publications, whose confident stride through corporate headquarters now faltered with uncharacteristic uncertainty. The Boston Museum of Science had been Sophia's choice, neutral territory with plenty to talk about if conversation stalled, a place where awkward silences could be filled with observations about exhibits rather than painful personal history. Alexander had readily agreed, grateful for her willingness to meet at all, and impressed by the strategic wisdom of her selection. Already he could see how her mind worked, methodical and thoughtful like his own. Alexander arrived 20 minutes early, dressed in the most casual clothes his closet offered, dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt. No tie, no luxury watch, nothing that screamed of the wealth and status that had defined his adult life. He found himself nervously pacing near the entrance, checking his phone with uncharacteristic frequency, his normally steady hands betraying a slight tremor. When he spotted Elena and Sophia approaching from the parking area, his heart raced like it hadn't since his first major business presentation fresh out of college. The physical resemblance between mother and daughter was striking from a distance. The same graceful walk, the same dark hair catching sunlight. But as they drew closer, the differences became more apparent. Sophia carried herself with a combination of teenage self-consciousness and innate confidence that reminded Alexander painfully of himself at that age. Sophia wore jeans and a faded t-shirt with the periodic table printed on it, her long dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. The casual outfit made her look younger, more vulnerable than she had appeared in his office, less the poised young woman and more the teenage girl she still was. Alexander was suddenly, painfully aware of all the birthdays, school events, and ordinary moments he had missed. First steps, lost teeth, school presentations, childhood illnesses, Halloween costumes, and bedtime stories. 15 years of daily life that could never be recovered, moments of connection and growth he would never experience. "Hello, Sophia," he said, his voice gentle. "Mr. Westridge," she replied formally, her expression guarded. "You can call me Alexander," he offered. "Or whatever makes you comfortable." Sophia nodded stiffly. "Alexander, then." The first hour was awkward, with conversation limited to exhibits and scientific concepts. Alexander was impressed by Sophia's knowledge, the quick way her mind worked, so similar to his own thinking processes. Gradually, the tension began to ease as they discovered shared interests in physics, astronomy, and technological innovation. Standing before a quantum physics display, Sophia finally asked the question that had clearly been on her mind: "Why didn't you ever try to find out if my mom was okay after you left?" The directness of the question, delivered without emotion, hit Alexander like a physical blow. "I did at first," he answered honestly. "But when my calls went unanswered, I convinced myself it was better to respect what I thought was her decision for a clean break." He paused, looking at his daughter's skeptical expression. "It was the wrong conclusion. I should have tried harder." "Yes, you should have," Sophia agreed, but some of the edge had left her voice. As the afternoon continued, Alexander found himself sharing stories of his own childhood, growing up with limited means but ambitious dreams, working multiple jobs to put himself through college. He talked about failures and setbacks that had shaped him, things he rarely discussed with anyone. "Mom says you're some kind of genius with technology and business strategies," Sophia said as they sat in the museum cafe, Elena having excused herself to give them time alone. Alexander smiled slightly. "Your mother gives me too much credit. I work hard and I see patterns others might miss. But from what I can tell, you've inherited the best parts of both our intelligences, and none of my worst traits. Which are? Sophia asked, one eyebrow raised in challenge. Stubbornness, workaholic tendencies, an unfortunate ability to focus so completely on a goal that I lose sight of what's truly important. He met her eyes directly. I don't want to pretend I'm perfect, Sophia. I've made serious mistakes. But I'd like the chance to do better, if you're willing to give me that opportunity. Sophia studied him with that penetrating gaze that was so much like his own. I haven't decided yet, she said finally. But I'm thinking about it. It was a beginning, tentative, fragile, but real. In the weeks that followed, Alexander rearranged his schedule to make time for Sophia. He attended her science competition, sitting proudly in the audience as she won first place. He hired the best education consultants to help her explore university options, respecting her independence when she firmly rejected any attempt to use his influence to secure advantages. For Elena, watching the growing connection between father and daughter brought complicated emotions. Pride in Sophia's maturity. Relief that Alexander was proving to be the kind of father their daughter deserved. And beneath it all, a stirring of feelings she had thought long buried. Alexander offered Elena the executive assistant position, but she declined. It would blur too many boundaries, she explained. Instead, he connected her with another company where her skills would be valued and fairly compensated. The salary allowed her to move them to a better apartment, in a neighborhood with an excellent school for Sophia's final years of high school. As autumn turned to winter, their unconventional family unit began establishing new traditions. Sunday dinners became sacred time for the three of them, sometimes awkward but increasingly comfortable as they navigated their new reality. Alexander learned to cook simple meals, a skill he'd never bothered to develop in his years of corporate success. Elena gradually lowered the protective walls she'd built around herself and Sophia. But like any family, they faced challenges. Alexander's workaholic habits didn't disappear overnight, leading to a heartbreaking moment when he missed Sophia's 16th birthday celebration due to an unmissable business crisis. The disappointment in her eyes when he arrived 3 hours late with expensive gifts and rehearsed apologies taught him more than any business failure ever had. Things don't fix broken promises, Sophia had said quietly, refusing the designer watch he'd brought. Time does. And you didn't give me that today. The incident forced Alexander to confront how deeply his identity was tied to his business success. With Elena's gentle guidance and Sophia's uncompromising honesty, he began the difficult work of reordering his priorities. 6 months after their first meeting at the museum, Boston had transformed from summer heat to autumn crispness. The leaves in the public garden had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, a natural display of transformation that seemed fitting for the changes occurring in Alexander's life. During those months, he had navigated the complicated terrain of building a relationship with his teenage daughter. There had been awkward moments, conversations that stalled, attempts at connection that missed their mark, occasions when he'd inadvertently offended Sophia by assuming too much or offering too little. But there had also been breakthroughs, an animated discussion about quantum physics that left them both exhilarated, a shared love of classic rock music discovered accidentally, the first time Sophia had texted him directly with a question about college applications. Elena had remained a careful guardian of these developing bonds, neither pushing Sophia toward Alexander nor standing in the way. She maintained her own cautious distance from him, cordial but reserved, her manner suggesting wounds still healing beneath the surface of civility. On a crisp October evening, Alexander invited both Elena and Sophia to his penthouse for dinner. Unlike previous gatherings where they had met in public places or the modest apartment Elena and Sophia shared, this invitation represented a new level of intimacy, access to his personal space, the domain where he lived rather than the public face he presented to the world. The penthouse, with its minimalist design and expensive furnishings, typically impressed visitors with its panoramic views and obvious luxury. But as Alexander prepared for Elena and Sophia's arrival, he found himself seeing the space through new eyes, noticing the absence of family photographs, the clinical perfection that spoke of a place maintained by staff rather than truly lived in, the subtle emptiness of a dwelling that had never been a home. He had given his housekeeper the night off, choosing instead to spend the day cooking himself, following recipes his own mother had used years ago in their modest kitchen, comfort food that represented his own humble beginnings rather than the refined cuisine he'd grown accustomed to at business dinners. The hours of chopping, stirring, and tasting had been unexpectedly therapeutic, connecting him to memories long buried beneath spreadsheets and acquisitions. When Elena and Sophia arrived, Alexander felt an unfamiliar nervousness. He needed, this evening to go well. Not just for the announcement he planned to make, but because their approval of his personal space suddenly mattered in a way no business associate's opinion ever had. Sophia moved around the penthouse with curious inspection, examining his bookshelves and the few personal items he displayed, while Elena stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, taking in the city lights spread out below. "It's beautiful," she acknowledged, her voice soft. "But it feels empty," Alexander finished for her. "I know. It's never really been a home. Just a place to sleep between workdays." Dinner was served at the rarely used dining table, which Alexander had set himself with careful attention. As they ate his mother's recipes, meatloaf with a tangy glaze, mashed potatoes with roasted garlic, green beans with almonds, conversation flowed more easily than he had dared to hope, loosened perhaps by the familiar comfort of the food and the evident effort he had made. As they finished dessert, an apple crisp that had filled the penthouse with cinnamon and warmth, Alexander set down his fork and gathered his courage. The moment had come to share the vision that had been forming in his mind since the day he discovered Sophia's existence. "I've been doing a lot of thinking these past months," he began, noting how both Elena and Sophia gave him their full attention. "About priorities, about legacy, about what success really means." He took a deep breath, glancing around the opulent space that suddenly seemed to represent everything he had pursued at the expense of what truly mattered. "I'm stepping back from day-to-day operations at Westridge Enterprises," he announced, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the decision. "I've appointed a new CEO, someone I trust to maintain the company's values while I focus on what matters most." The board approved the transition yesterday. Elena looked surprised. "Are you sure that's what you want?" "I've spent 15 years chasing success," Alexander replied. "I defined it as wealth, power, and influence. But meeting you again, knowing Sophia, it's changed everything." He turned to his daughter. "I missed 15 years of your life. I don't want to miss another moment." Sophia, who had grown more comfortable with him but still maintained a careful emotional distance, studied his face. "What will you do instead?" "I'm establishing a foundation," Alexander explained. "Focused on supporting single parents and their children, providing educational opportunities and practical support." He looked at Elena. "Your experiences showed me how many talented people are held back by circumstances, not ability. I want to change that." Elena felt tears threatening. "That's a worthy goal." "There's more," Alexander continued, suddenly looking nervous. "The foundation needs a director. Someone with first-hand understanding of the challenges, intelligence, and compassion. Elena, I was hoping you might consider taking the position." Elena's eyes widened. "Me? But I don't have the experience." "You raised an extraordinary daughter with limited resources while completing your education and building a career," Alexander interrupted gently. "There's no experience more relevant than that." Later that evening, after Sophia had gone to explore the penthouse's library, Alexander and Elena stood on the balcony overlooking the city lights. "You've changed," Elena observed. The Alexander the First knew was brilliant but single-minded. "Driven." "I'm still driven," he admitted. "But my destination has changed. Success looks different to me now." He turned to face her. "I never stopped thinking about you, Elena. Even when I convinced myself I had moved on." Elena looked away. "We can't go back to who we were." "I don't want to," Alexander replied. "I like who we're becoming now, all of us, much better." Slowly, cautiously, they began rebuilding not just a co-parenting relationship but a friendship that honored their shared history while acknowledging how much they had both changed. It wasn't always easy. They disagreed on parenting approaches, on money, on a dozen everyday matters. But underneath the disagreements was a growing foundation of mutual respect. On the first anniversary of their reunion, Alexander invited both Elena and Sophia to the grand opening of the Westridge Family Foundation's first community center. As he prepared to cut the ribbon, he asked them both to join him on the podium. "A year ago," he said to the gathered crowd, "I thought I had everything success could offer. I was wrong. I was wealthy but impoverished in all the ways that truly matter." He looked at Sophia and Elena. "Family isn't just about biology or shared names. It's about showing up, every day even when it's difficult. It's about learning and growing together." As they cut the ribbon together, Sophia leaned close to whisper, "Not bad for a workaholic billionaire dad." It was the first time she had called him Dad. Alexander felt his heart expand with a joy no business success had ever provided. Later that evening, as they celebrated privately, Sophia presented them both with gifts, photo albums she had created, one for each of them. Alexander's contained photographs Elena had shared of Sophia's childhood, carefully annotated with stories and memories. Elena's contained photographs from the past year, moments Alexander had captured of mother and daughter together, preserving their special bond. "I thought maybe we could start filling in the blank pages together," Sophia explained, pointing to the empty pages at the end of each album. "For the future." As they looked through the albums together, laughing at some photos and growing quiet at others, Alexander reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a chance interview to a family being rebuilt, their story was still unfolding, still being written day by day. Some wounds would never completely heal. Some years could never be recovered. But in forgiving each other, in choosing to build something new from the fragments of what had been broken, they had discovered a profound truth. Family isn't what you're born into. It's what you build, nurture, and cherish through conscious choice, every single day. The wealth that truly mattered, Alexander now understood, wasn't counted in dollars or measured in stock prices. It was calculated in moments of connection, in the privilege of watching his daughter grow into her potential, in the quiet joy of building a future where all three of them could thrive as individuals while remaining connected as a family. And that was a fortune beyond measure. 2 years later, on a warm spring afternoon, Alexander stood at the edge of a university campus, watching as graduates in caps and gowns streamed across the quad. Among them walked Sophia, who had completed her undergraduate degree in physics with honors in just 3 years, her academic brilliance propelling her forward at an accelerated pace. Beside Alexander stood Elena, her eyes shining with maternal pride. The years had softened the edges between them, transforming old wounds into shared wisdom. They weren't romantic partners. That possibility had been discussed once, tentatively, before both acknowledged that their paths had diverged too significantly to reconnect in that way. But they had become something equally valuable. Co-parents who respected each other, friends who understood each other's strengths and flaws, partners in the shared project of supporting their remarkable daughter. "She did it," Elena whispered, clutching the ceremony program. "And she's only 18. "Thanks to you," Alexander replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave her the foundation. You're the reason she's thriving." Elena shook her head. "We both contributed. Your genes gave her that brilliant analytical mind. And your heart gave her the compassion to use it wisely," Alexander countered. As they watched Sophia accept her diploma, both parents felt the weight of the journey that had brought them to this moment. The missed years, the painful discoveries, the slow, steady work of building trust and connection. The path hadn't been smooth. There had been arguments and misunderstandings, moments when old hurts resurfaced, occasions when Alexander's workaholic tendencies threatened to undermine his new priorities. But through it all, they had persevered, guided by the shared belief that family, however unconventional, however belatedly formed, was worth fighting for. After the ceremony, as they celebrated at a restaurant Sophia had chosen, Alexander watched his daughter explaining complex physics theories to her mother, her hands animated, her eyes bright with passion for her subject. The Westridge Family Foundation, now thriving under Elena's capable direction, had already helped dozens of single parents pursue education and career advancement while supporting their children. Sophia had developed a mentorship program within the foundation specifically for girls interested in STEM fields, using her own experience as inspiration. The wealth that had once been Alexander's primary measure of success now served a greater purpose, creating opportunities, removing barriers, building bridges between privilege and potential. In the process, he had discovered that true fulfillment came not from acquisition but from contribution, not from power but from purpose. As the sun set over Boston that evening, casting long shadows across the city where their story had begun, ended, and begun again, 3 people who had once been strangers connected only by biology sat together, sharing memories and making plans. Sophia would begin her graduate studies in the fall. Elena was considering expanding the foundation's reach to other cities. Alexander was mentoring young entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds, sharing the business acumen he had spent decades developing. The past could not be changed. The years lost could never be recovered, the mistakes never fully erased. But the future stretched before them, not perfect, not without challenges, but rich with possibility and love. They had learned, all 3 in their own ways, that family isn't defined by conventional structures or uninterrupted presence. It's defined by choice, the daily decision to show up, to listen, to grow, to forgive. In the soft evening light, as laughter flowed easily between them, the truth they had discovered together became clear. What matters most in life isn't the wealth we accumulate or the power we wield, but the lives we touch, the love we share, and the family we build, sometimes in the most unexpected ways and against the greatest odds. For it is not money that makes a life rich, but the connections we nurture through both easy times and difficult ones. True wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or corporate acquisitions, but in the hearts we touch and the lives we help to flourish. And the most valuable legacy we can leave behind isn't a fortune in assets, but the love we've given freely and the positive difference we've made in the lives of others. Family, whether formed by birth, by choice, or by reconciliation after long absence, remains humanity's greatest treasure and most powerful source of meaning. In the end, it is not the materials of our lives that define us, but the connections we forge, the wounds we heal, and the love we cultivate that truly make us wealthy beyond measure.